This is the tutorial lecture for Chapter 3 of Part 2, Shopping. After reading Chapter 3 of The Handmaid's Tale, you should be noticing some patterns emerging in terms of themes, issues, characterisation and setting. Continue to track these elements so you'll be able to comment on their overall development. You might start to consider the use of binary opposites operating in the text, male versus female, freedom, and how it's represented in opposition to constraint. Secondly, summarise the specific functions of the opening 3 chapters, the exposition, in terms of what is established and why, and then go to the how. Thirdly, whose story is being told here? Certainly our protagonist, but consider the group or the voice that she represents. In what ways does the telling influence our response? And finally, note down the what-if scenario that is the foundation for the science fiction elements of the text. Look further below to the notes on the flower symbolism. Here we get a reference to the colour red or crimson and ensures the image of blood, life, loss and sacrifice remains in our mind's eye from previous chapters. It refers to the garden as the domain of the commander's wife, as the protagonist observes through her shatterproof window. Masculine control is ever present, despite the commander's wife's ownership of the garden. The male role here is both protector and enforcer in the figure that is the guardian. He prevents the wife from exerting effort or dirtying her hands, but also serves to prevent escape or the unwanted presence of visitors. Flowers and gardens traditionally symbolise fertility, the blossoming maturity and sexual ripening of a young woman, in addition to the almost maternal tending to the young plants. Potential, growth and Mother Nature come to the fore here. Unfortunately, our protagonist is denied even this pleasure. Her sexuality is being exploited, and she is both physically and metaphorically separated from the commander's wife's domain, relegated once again to the role of observer. Pause to consider the commander's wife and how she's characterised. Do you perceive her garden to be empowering, an outlet for expression, an escape, or a constraint? Explain your views. Generic names continue to categorise, disempower, and dehumanise the inhabitants of this world, particularly women, although it does constrain men as well. We'll discuss this later. The wife's sense of belonging is contingent on the status of her husband, where male identity stems from military rank, such as the commander. Those titles hold far more status and power. The domestic sphere is the only world women are permitted to control. It seems it is also the only context in which they can express the need to nurture and raise or grow something. Once more, Atwood links the past to the present. Once I had a garden. I can remember the smell of the turned earth. Present constraints trigger fond memories of a time of greater freedom for our protagonist, greater engagement and peace, commonly associated with time in nature or the garden. Sensory imagery amplifies what has been lost, feeling, variation, uniqueness, nurturing of the spirit. The protagonist's memory suggests that the commander's wife's present-day existence is merely the passing of time. Attitudes don't change, and her situation seems irreversible. Where is the spontaneity, choice, celebration, or living? The wife is categorised by her pastimes. What connotations do you associate with sewing, knitting, and wanting a challenge? What is the effect of the final sentence of this paragraph? They aren't scarves for grown men, but for children. Again, the angels at the front line, the incongruence of the images of angelic women and the expectations, and war highlight the context of conflict or a battle for values. What impact does this juxtaposition have for you? And the notion that angels can be used in a war at the front line and be exposed to the greatest danger. Sometimes I think these scarves aren't sent to the angels at all. Again, the incongruence of the image of angelic women in war highlights the context or conflict of battle of values, and what impact does this juxtaposition have for you, as we've said. But consider the significance of both the narrator's ability to think beyond the obvious and not accept things at face value, and the patriarchal need to keep the wives busy. It also shows her ability to think and to challenge her surroundings and the status quo and information that is presented as a given. Our protagonist asks, what does the commander's wife envy me? If she's already got small goals in a domain that she seems to control, what on earth could she envy me? She doesn't speak to me unless she can't avoid it. I am a reproach to her and a necessity. And it's this paradox that we now discuss. So first of all, why separate the sentence, what does she envy me? What is emphasised and how does this develop key ideas in the text? Closely examine the paradox of simultaneously representing a reproach and a necessity. Identify the irony and what it reveals about this world's experience of reproduction, control, and choice. And again, the ways that women are encouraged to perceive and judge each other, to compete, and to be deemed failures and successes based on their ability to reproduce. The word choice diction of posting also evokes notions of war, of unrest, the need for defence and military action, and predominantly the duty of one's service to their country. Is there a sense of competition here? And what strengths or advantages does each have over the other in such a comparison? And how do these advantages relate to their survival in this world order? This begs the question, who grants permission for entry? On first days, they're permitted front doors, but after that, we're supposed to use the back. Things haven't settled down, it's too soon. Everyone is unsure about our exact status. After a while, it will be either all front doors or all back. So why are there such strict rules? Of what is the reigning body fearful, and who determines the status of individuals and groups? This echoes the Jim Crow system in America's past, in which African Americans were deemed subhuman and reminded of their class via entering buildings through the back door. We see these references in Australian texts too, such as No Sugar, post-colonial revisionist texts that challenge us to think about inequality in our past. So how are these expectations working in this text? To show a certain category, a certain group, their place in the world order. At this stage of the exposition, what understanding or picture have you developed of this futuristic class system rooted in gender discrimination? Lydia said she was lobbying for the front. She's once again a voice for the oppressed and working within a constraining environment. This could, however, be read as contributing to the status quo by accepting the categorisation of women in the first place. And we'll talk more about dominant and resistant readings once you've read more of the novel. Yours is a position of honour, says Aunt Lydia. Examine the irony of the title and the treatment. The guardian rang the doorbell for me. Is this chivalry or chauvinism? Is it respect or control? Consider how the ensuing characterisation of the commander's wife develops ideas raised earlier in chapters 2 and 3. Identify quotes that evince her desire for some control and authority. Her behaviour towards the narrator is often read as overcompensation for her inability to reproduce, to create life. Do you feel this reading is justified? The guardian set down the bag and saluted her, and she feels our protagonist as if a protective arm is being withdrawn. So what might the guardian protect her from? Do we get the feeling that our narrator has experienced something like this before. Identify now how Atwood juxtaposes the status of the two women. Pause to consider how both women may be constrained by their context, despite the wife's impressive wealth, as evinced by the ivory head of her cane and the large diamonds on her fingers. How is the symbolism of the diamond ring operating here, and the way that she looks at it? Record how the commander's wife is characterised through her actions and her speech, as relayed by our protagonist, and the narrator's selection of detail, and to what extent does the selection of detail position us to understand these characters in particular ways. Describe this moment from the point of view of Aunt Lydia and the narrator and the commander's wife, and get a sense of their context and how these might shape their perspectives on the situation. What is Aunt Lydia asking the narrator to understand, and how do we respond to this? Describe the effect of diction and images such as gripped there, small vertical lines and ivory coloured. What do these details add to the overall impression of the wife and her house? Discuss the implications of the possibility of a black market trade, particularly if real money doesn't exist anymore. Why might liquor, coffee and cigarettes be forbidden for the narrator? What circumstance might she be in? Dystopic fiction explores unsettling future scenarios. It gets us thinking about our current context and challenges us to think about possible changes. In this case, a world where a fertile womb is a valuable commodity in a toxic and oppressive environment. The cigarettes must be black market, I thought, and this gave me hope. Even now that there is no real money anymore, there's still a black market. There's always a black market. There's always something that can be exchanged. She then was a woman who might bend the rules, but what did I have to trade? So, what could be the significance, knowing that the commander's wife could potentially bend the rules and might not be 100% rigidly controlled by her society? In fact, the commander's wife says to the protagonist, "So, old what's-his-face didn't work out. Tough luck on him. This is your second, isn't it?" To which the narrator replies, "Third, ma'am." The commander's wife said, "Not so good for you either." And there was another coughing laugh. This reveals that it is the older men with status and esteem who are employing the handmaids and using them to reproduce, as their wives are no longer capable of doing so. What is being valued here, and what could be some of the implications of this for the handmaids and for larger society? Does the value and the importance in that regard match with the language that's being used to describe these women and their treatment? Can you link this to any issues and attitudes in our own world? Identify the subversive nature of the commander's wife's laugh and what attitude is represented here. Our first more direct reference to the narrator's posting and attempt at pregnancy, where she said it's the third, is significant. And again, looking at women as incubators as opposed to individuals. Pause to read the biblical story in Genesis of Rachel, whose command to her husband Jacob was, "Behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her." This underpins the concept of handmaids and surrogacy in the text and provides strong links to science advancements of our time. The reader can't help but consider whether she has had a child with the Luke mentioned earlier. If so, where is her child and family? Why is she not with them? What kind of a future world separates a family in this way? Can you make connections with issues in our current world? Third time appears to be the limit. So what are the implications of this expiry date for human beings, for childbearing women? Pause to consider the required age range and use of the female incubators in comparison with the older men siring the babies. What are your thoughts? This suggests that Commander's wife is capable of breaking the rules, as we said earlier. Does this indicate a self-serving nature, a need to connect with others, or a manipulative attempt to garner the loyalty of her newest competition? Consider how characterisation so far has led to your understanding, your choice of reading here. The narrator then goes on to say, later I would have more than enough time to take in her surroundings. This reveals that she'll be staying with the couple if and when she is pregnant with their child. Consider the various aspects of this situation, treating women as incubators, the discomfort and shame of being faced with a person who can give your partner something you cannot, and having your life completely controlled, even the giving of life. Or is it an opportunity? Discuss your response to this. It also evokes a lost time, as much as the wife's current comfortable life, when she's thinking about the bunches of flowers and gazing into the mirror. All the accoutrements of contentment and status, but not necessarily a happy life for the commander's wife either. Now her face was on a level with mine. I thought I recognised her, or at least there was something familiar about her. Apart from the wife's previous individual identity that the narrator will recall, this also suggests that they connect as women in these terrible circumstances, that they are battling similar larger issues and attitudes as a group. List these now. This paragraph continues with a long description of the commander's wife. Underline or highlight key terms and adjectives that you feel most position you towards her. Which aspects of her appearance seem to reflect personality traits, and how do these fit with her previous characterisation? The wife seems to understand our narrator's position when she says, I expect you feel the same about me, but also sees her as competition and a reminder of her own shortcomings. The forthcoming description in the chapter also suggests the wife's resilience and the narrator's desire to connect, even befriend her. But she thinks, I didn't answer, as a yes would have been insulting, a no contradictory. The narrator retains her humanity and yearns for a familial connection and support. She longs to be understood and feel safe and heard. Clearly, this isn't her first posting. She has been called to duty previously. The reference to the commander's wife having seen her file evokes images of a Big Brother regime from 1984, for example, always overseeing, judging and controlling. The impersonal nature of the word and the meeting reinforces the business-like atmosphere and clinical transaction-like nature that is being maintained. The commander's wife goes on to say, I know you aren't stupid. But she does say, if I get trouble, I'll give trouble back. You understand? She also doesn't want to be called ma'am. Women are consistently defined as the wife, the Marthas, the handmaids, and oppressed by gender discourse that relegates them to the domestic sphere and possession of men. There is none of the status that comes with men's military position, and if they are unable to bear a child, they become unwomen, exiled from Gilead. Made-up terms such as this remind us that this is sci-fi, but this futurescape still sounds familiar if we look at Western history, such as the Jewish Holocaust. Look at the language, the persecution, the treatment of groups, the ostracism, and the deaths. We move on to the wife's behaviours, and these also set her apart from the norm, just as her earlier willingness to bend rules, as was suggested. Keep track of these elements that establish her individuality or strength, and also her hardness as she survives in this patriarchy, under a regime that demands conformity. It's a social structure that gains its validity and power through this very same conformity of the women and people knowing their place. The wife is certainly possessive when she says, "My husband, I want that to be perfectly clear. Till death do us part, it's final." And it certainly establishes her authority. But think about the tone. Does she appear happy or in love, as we might expect from associations of our own context? What does this reveal about future attitudes? The sinister and damning tone of "it's final" may hold many connotations. So pause to name some. She then talks about the dolls and remembers a past life in which young girls would have dolls to play with. But they were the dolls where you'd pull the string at the back and the monotone voice reciting what was expected would come out. So the irony that she is a puppet here, being objectified, dehumanised and forced to conform, is significant, as is the reminder of what has been lost or sacrificed in this future society: play, the innocence of childhood, love and spontaneity. As before, references to the past and flashbacks serve to highlight the importance of values upheld in society before. The protagonist forgets that the commander's wife has said, "Don't call me ma'am." So do you feel that she's nervous, absent-minded? Is she distracted or deep in thought? And what might this suggest about our narrator? Could it be deliberate? We get the first reference to scriptural precedent. This first direct reference to the scripture informing laws and regulations signifies the foundation of this theocratic regime. We will come to learn that the Republic of Gilead may be based on the values of the past, but promote a far more extreme or fundamental ideology. Where do we see such fundamentalist religious ideology in our world? What's the basis for that thinking? What do they use to justify their actions, the people that subscribe to these views? And how are these views used to attain and sustain power over others? What do you think is the link here between the wife saying it's one of the things we fought for and staring at her diamond rings, as mentioned earlier? Does her body language reveal something that her voice isn't? It's one of the things we fought for, she says, and this echoes the feminist battle for equal rights, freedoms and recognition. This is interesting, as today we may feel society has progressed in this regard in many areas. The Republic of Gilead presents a far more conventional and unequal society with misogynistic views. Do you see this as a plausible possibility for our future? Can you think of current events in the media that seem to indicate that some of these supposedly outdated views still exist? And how could these worsen in the future? What may need to happen to result in such a regression? The pattern of links between past and present continues via flashback. In television evangelist style, Serena Joy attained celebrity through her talent as a gospel singer, bringing faith to children in particular. How does this increase the sense of loss and hardening in the current day? Serena: what on earth could have happened to trigger such a change in circumstance, identity, and personality? She used to bring tears to her audience and cry herself, being caught up and swept up in her faith and trying to convey her faith to the children who viewed her show. In addition to the above note, the repetition of "was" effectively cements Serena Joy's loss of individual identity and a time when religious belief in their world was something to celebrate. We still are not privy to the protagonist's name by the end of chapter 3, just her position, worth, her longings, and possible fate. Why does Atwood maintain her narrator's anonymity, considering the themes of the novel? Again, Atwood ends a chapter with a cliffhanger or a statement that leaves us guessing and contemplating the implications of events. What are you anticipating their relationship will be like in the coming chapters? Be sure to note your understandings and questions before progressing to chapters 4 to 6, where we meet new important characters and gain an insight into the routine daily life and expectations of the handmaids. Pause after chapter 3 to also list representations and patterns that you've noticed and link evidence to each of these so you can track their development through the rest of the novel.